Hello and welcome to another episode of Will It Play? You asked, you put in your poll and your vote, you said you wanted to see Monster Hunter Rise and how well it can play on mobile systems such as the GPD Win 3 and the Aya Neo. Let's try it out and find out how well it works. Here we are, everybody. We're going to start off with the Aya Neo. Now, this is a newer product that actually came into play. They already got the next coming out with a newer system, but we're going to try this out because the Aya Neo is actually known to be a pocket gaming PC. Well, not so much for pocketing. And of course, it is the size of roughly a Nintendo Switch. As you can see, there are different settings that we will be able to mess around with here for the power and the balancing. So we will give that a try. We'll start with some Monster Hunter Rise. Now, this is the game that everyone was voting for over on Twitter. Of course, it takes a moment for it to load up. And the game does, in fact, load up. And it does have to capture the cache and everything else for it. The one big problem that it has when you first boot it up is it will change it all the way down to around 600 by 800, which, as you can clearly see, it does not look pretty whatsoever. What it will do at the beginning, if you ever update your drivers, is actually start to take and cache all the graphics. Now, it's the same thing with anything else whenever you update your graphics and your graphics cards. As you can clearly see, it's computing the cache. So we're going to let it do that, and we'll fast forward through this. Something also to note while this is going on is that the game actually does boot up. The only thing you have to worry about is after it boots up is the setup process so that you can actually have the better video resolution while you play the game, provided you can play it. Now, the system is rated to have a 6-hour-long battery life depending on your settings and game. We'll be able to go into that as well as the settings for the GPD Win whenever we get the chance. When the game first launches, of course, it's going to be loading in this very in particular, unoriginal screen resolution. Now, we're going to fix that whenever the game starts to load up fully. Sometimes, if you update your drivers, you will find that your system will have to redo the shader cache. And here at the resolution, we can see right now we're only pushing 60 FPS, 200 megahertz on the GPU. The memory isn't being used up all that much, neither is the CPU. Currently, use of RAM is currently 8 out of 16 gigs. And we're going to fix this video resolution problem here. It's going to take but a quick moment. What you need to do is go into your options, go down to display. And it's going to be the 4th option from the top. You switch that over to borderless window, you hit confirm, and then you have your full screen capabilities. After in which it'll save, and then we're going to continue on. Right now the game is running at around 30 to 40 frames per second until, of course, it reaches this menu. We'll load this up, of course, setting it at currently 60 FPS. The current setting that we have the game set for, most of the settings that will go onto the game are all in medium settings. So we right now are set for power saving, and we still run 60 FPS, which is the screen resolution capabilities. We'll rock it down to 5 watts to see how well it runs. And it's somewhat playable at around 27 frames per second. Now, you will have to probably tweak things out for your settings whenever you want to go any lower on your resolution or your power options for TDP. And here's why. Whenever it comes to wanting to save on battery, you want to go as low as you possibly can. Boom, we'll hit low, and the game still rocks at around 26, 25, 28 frames per second. We'll load into a match here. We'll go into an area where we can actually do a test around one of the maps. Let's see, where's a good one? The ruins looks like a good place. We'll go to the ruins during the daytime. As you can clearly see, the GPU is still keeping nice and cool at 42 degrees Celsius at 200 megahertz. The CPU, on the other hand, 64% at 400 megahertz at 5 watts. Now, the menu will run at around 60 FPS. That's going to be a given because there's not much going on around here. The loading times will vary because you got to know we're running at 5 watts right now for TDP, so the CPU package is rocking anywhere between 5 to 6 watts in total. Now, inside the game, we can clearly see whenever we're in a match, things are working a little bit sluggish. So I think the sweet spot for this game is going to be power save mode. In power save mode, you got about 11 watts to work with. It'll push the GPU up a little bit more, but the CPU up to around 12.1 watts. Clearly, the game is fully visible and playable. We'll go into the settings, and we can now actually change it back from low settings to about average. This will actually give you enough battery life to truly enjoy the game, but as well as the fidelity of the graphics. Now, the input for the game isn't actually bad. It's pretty spot on, and for average, it's able to run the game still at 60 FPS, even for a small open area like this. We'll go into an open area now and see how things work while we're still rocking it at around 11 watts. It still pushes 60 FPS. Let's see how well we can do it balanced. Or better yet, I got a better idea. Let's see how far we can push the graphics until it really starts to struggle. So we'll change it from average to high settings. And that's whenever it starts to struggle a little bit. As you can see, it started to fluctuate down to around 40 FPS average to around 38 FPS average, depending on where you're going and what you're doing. And this is at 11 watts in high video settings. The game still looks really great. The input isn't too bad. There's a little bit of a delay, and of course it'll start to slow down a bit. Now if we go back up to the full TDP capabilities of around 15 watts, we can see that the package jumps up to around 50, almost 50 frames per second, roughly 48. And it is still within a playable bounds, 50 to 48. Game is still very much playable here. And you gotta know, this is rocking an AMD APU 4800U at roughly around 2 gigahertz. The GPU isn't pushing very hard. It's only at 1100 megahertz during gameplay. The CPU barely pushing 2.1 gigahertz to 2.5. The amount of memory for video is around 3 gigabytes, and of course the average use is around 9. Now on high settings, it might be better to set it into game mode, which gives it up to about 20 watts and pushes it around 50 FPS plus. As we can clearly see, the game is still playable. We'll start fighting off with this baggie a little bit and see how far we can push our bounds. Around 50 FPS, and you gotta know, we're not using that much battery power. As the GPU only rocks at almost around 1 gigahertz at average, the CPU anywhere around 1800 at average, even though it still shows at around 1600. At 48 FPS, that's not half bad. You know you'll be able to play the game and enjoy it to its fullest extent. Switching over to the wonderful GPD Win 3, we currently see that it has a nice little keyboard, a small 5-inch screen, whereas the Aya Neo currently has a 7-inch. We'll wake it up and let's get to rocking it out. Now the current settings in the BIOS for the Aya Neo are pretty much standard, as well as they are with the GPD Win 3. GPD Win 3, I have everything set to normal settings, so it will not use any more than the package setting of around 20 watts. Also bear in mind that the console here, or the system of the GPD Win 3, runs a 720p screen. As the game loads up, we'll see that there's going to be probably a little bit of a disruption, but there's also something else in addition. There is a nice little, quote, mod that was used in the GPD Win 3 for certain games to run. As we can clearly see, the game is struggling to load, and we'll see if it actually does fully load at one point. Here we do see that the game does run and work. By the looks of it, it's running at full resolution at 720p. It's loaded the gamepad, and of course I did set it up for gamepad mode via the switch on the side. Now the mod that they have for older games has not been loaded up, and of course since the update to Windows 11, we can see that the shader cache and computing caches have to be loaded up. We'll give this a moment. We'll fast forward through this point. There we go. Now that the game is fully compiled, you can see that it jumped up with DirectX 12 at 60 frames per second. Now things started to cool off. Now it's at around 60 degrees Celsius as it goes down to 4.7, goes up to 4.7 megahertz. The video settings are spot on now. This was right out of the box with no modification required. There's a little picture of me, of course. Whereas with the Aya Neo, we had to change some things. Checking the display settings, we have it set to full screen. We're going to go to borderless window. It currently runs at 720p, as we can clearly see. And of course, with the advanced settings, we have it set to at least mid or low. The graphical memory, it shows that there's 8 gigabytes of RAM. Unfortunately, due to how GPU usage is in an Intel integrated graphics, it shares the memory with the system. So we'll hit continue and see how things look in menu-wise at around 50 to 60 FPS. We'll start loading it up from here. It sometimes jumps up to around 61 FPS, and loading into the game itself, it takes almost no time. The controls are very nice and feelable, and it does fluctuate around 50 to 60 FPS. Now the settings for the videos at the moment in the display is set to custom, so what we'll do is we'll set this to average, and then we will set it. We can still see that it caps at around 50 FPS, almost 60, which is remarkable considering this game is actually originally made to have something with a GPU. The requirements for this game are a little bit higher than what we're holding on to. So let's take a look at how things look in the game for low video settings. You can clearly see it does change a bit, and the GPU caps out at around 98 to 99% use, whereas the CPU is at around 43. We now have what's called a CPU bottleneck. The GPU cannot keep up. Of course, the graphics aren't going to look pretty, but you're on a 5-inch screen, so what do you expect? It does jump up at around 161 to 60 FPS, which isn't too bad. From a far away distance, we can clearly see it jumps down to around 40. Let's see how things look whenever we set the graphical settings up to the highest setting. Now, it does look pretty at first, and it does drop down to around 30 FPS. At 30 is still very much playable, as that's generally the standard for the game during the time frame of the Nintendo Wii when it came to Monster Hunter Tri. Currently, we see it around 38, 39 frames per second in the middle of town. We will start off in a nice little village quest on an expedition tour, going around what is considered the ruins during the daytime. This will really show how well the system will run. This is all on normal settings. What we'll do is we'll change it all the way down to low. As we can clearly see, it does jump up to 60 FPS. One thing we do need to check before we go is if there is a cap, and there is a frame limit cap to 60. We'll push it up to around unlimited. That way we can really see how far we can push it, and it still caps out at around 60 FPS. One thing we will have to check and see if there is in fact a G-Sync or a V-Sync, and it is turned on, so we'll turn that off so we can really maximize, considering the screen is built for 60 FPS. So we'll hit the right trigger, go on our little departure, and everything's set to low. We can clearly see that the GPU really pushes at its maximum for internal graphics. In the middle of the game, you can see that it does almost 120 frames per second, and you gotta know this is set to low at 720p. We'll switch over our video settings to see how things look on average. Still with unlimited settings and no G-Sync, and it pushes up at around 70 to 80 frames per second, which is still a beautiful gameplay footage. Now there is a bit of a delay by the feel of it. So we'll switch over to the options and see how things look on high settings. Now you do see a snag just for a moment, and the game still pushes on to around 60 FPS. Now how this little device is capable of pushing up to around 55 FPS on a high on a standard package of what looks to be around 19 watts is it is set up to about 20 watts in full power, which is equivalent to the Aya Neo. Now the game is running at 720p instead of 800p, which does make a difference. The system on the Aya Neo running at 800p has a little bit more to render. That's 80 pixels extra. I know, it doesn't seem like much whenever it comes down to the nitty-gritty, but it does make a slight difference depending on what the general standard for screens are. Now it does seem to stop at around almost 60 FPS, but that GPU is being pegged at 90 frames per 90%. The CPU at around 67 degrees Celsius and 50% use, we can clearly see that this system is fully capable of running the game at 720p on the high settings. Now let's give it a try whenever we find a monster. Now, as there's a lot of things going on the screen as we're still in advanced, which is high video settings, we can still see that it's still tugging along at almost a rough 60 FPS and average at around 58. Now, I know this is kind of unusual. You'd figure, why is a little thing like an Intel-based system doing so ridiculously well compared to the AMD? Believe it or not, there's one factor that I did not incorporate for the AMD system, and this was not, of course, recorded, and that is the fact that VSync was in fact enabled, and that the maximum graphics settings were set to a maximum 90 to 120 frames per second. Another thing to also incorporate is the fact that it's still pushing almost to around 20 watts of power on the package and advanced. Oh, that's on average. On lower settings, it doesn't do very much as it starts to drop down to around 13 to 14 watts and still running the beautiful 60 FPS. So for something for mobile gaming, believe it or not, as much as this device costs, and it's currently now out with an 1195 G7, which could push a little bit more frames and probably more energy efficiency, I would say between the two of them, the best play experience isn't exactly one or the other, but both of them. So the real question is, will it play? The answer is yes, it will play. It'll play really grand right here on the GPD Win 3, as well as it will with the Aya Neo Pro 2021 edition. Really makes the gameplay a lot of fun. If you want something for battery life and better feeling control, I would say go with the Aya Neo because the screen is so much bigger, and with the appropriate caps on this on the joysticks, you can get a little bit more better feeling out of them. If you want something that's really going to be just portableized and on the go, you really don't care, I would say go with the GPD Win 3. Of course, you will have to bear in mind getting that controller connector is going to be a thing, because I can tell you, even with the settings set to low, I can feel the heat already being produced through the actual device and into the actual controller, which is very warm to the touch. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit that like and subscribe button, and like always, have fun. The next video will be posted up sooner than later. What game we're going to test out next, we'll take a look. Chances are it might be Destiny 2. Hope you guys had a great one, and keep being amazing.